There you go. We're all set.
Okay, great, great. Well, again, welcome folks, and thanks for waiting a few minutes for me. I don't think I hopefully broke too many laws getting back to my office. So we're going to talk about really this interface here of the medical and the school communities working together to get kids with concussions back into school and ultimately helping them recover. Just as a disclosure, I am a test author for a number of tests for which I receive some royalties, but I've developed a lot of other tests, most of which I'll talk about today. Well, I'm not going to talk that much about tests, but certainly these are things that are concussion related and have informed what we understand about concussion, that there is no royalty associated with it. So again, we want to talk about really that need for a complementary relationship between the medical and the school systems as they support kids getting back to school. This is a task that really does require both the medical and the school system to really continue to develop themselves in supporting kids' return. I think in my experience, not only locally but nationally, the medical system certainly needs its education in terms of how it can facilitate things, and the receiving schools need some help as well. And as we know across the country, some places do it better than others. So to the extent that we can continue to help both systems recognize their role, that's a great thing. So it is all about defining the roles, and ultimately I want to describe a set of coordinated pathways and tools to guide that return. One of the things I will also acknowledge from the outset is that the numbers of programs that are out there now, whether it's Karen McAvoy's REAP program or Brenda Egan-Brown's Brain Steps program, or Anne Glang's Brain 101 program, and a number of others. They more developing. Anne's program is the one that has most of the research behind it now, and what's important is to recognize we need ultimately good evidence behind this. But let me give you kind of a reason. So I'm a clinician in addition to a researcher and a teacher trainer. And this is a case of a girl I saw just a few months ago where the coordination between the systems really sort of fell down. And as a result, her recovery probably was not as smooth as it could have been. I don't know that it necessarily had anything to do with a delayed or prolonged recovery, but certainly it didn't help. So Ellie was a 13-year-old 8th grade girl, and as you might imagine from the pictures there, she's in cheer. Now that doesn't mean she's a cheerleader necessarily. She is basically an acrobat in the air. And she was injured during cheer practice. She was actually one of those people down below there trying to catch the flyer who fell on top of her and kind of blew her back a little bit. She hit the back of her head on the floor. It was indoors. Interestingly, and this was not a school-related activity at the time, and the coach actually recognized something was not right. So we always teach, blow plus change in function, took her out of action. So good move there. Ellie is a kid that comes with a little bit of baggage, so to speak. ADHD, had a school plan, 504 plan, some anxiety, has some migraine headaches, and has some challenges with her sleep. What happened is she presented with fairly typical kinds of symptoms, although a pretty severe headache, nausea, dizziness, sensitivity to light, her balance was way off. She didn't report any cognitive or emotional symptoms at the time. So again, take it out of practice, coach calls mom, they take her to the local emergency department, they do a CT scan, which is not generally required, but my guess is because of the severity of that headache, they were concerned. And her general physical neuro exam was okay. She was given some medicine to kind of manage that nausea. But there were no kind of guidance, no management guidance given, no discharge education, no kind of communication for the school. But was told, follow up with your pediatrician. And our clinic is called the SCORE Clinic, and go to the SCORE Clinic. Now, this is a Thursday when it happens. So she didn't attend school on Friday, slept most of the day, was really wiped out, headaches over the weekend, but her dizziness and nausea had resolved. Goes to school on Monday and Tuesday. Well, school was made aware of the injury, but because she had no kind of medical note or anything for the school, they said, well, this is business as usual. So she was required to attend gym that day, and she played dodgeball on Tuesday. And as you might imagine, you know what happens next, right? Hit in the head with a ball, and it increases her symptoms again now. Did get to the pediatrician on Wednesday, and the pediatrician now began some good management, recommending again no school, given the level of her symptoms for the next few days, and a progressive return plan with accommodations. And she had about a 3-week period of recovery. She saw me toward the end of her recovery. But this was an example, I think, of some problems, some challenges, and some opportunities that we might think about moving forward. Number one, positive. So the coach, the non-medical folks actually did a good job. The family also had a pretty good understanding. Mom came in and she was pretty well aware of what was going on, and she was doing her best to advocate. The primary care also, when they finally got to the primary care, did a pretty good evaluation and some pretty good recommendations. Some challenges, though: the emergency department, no communication, no information about kids' symptom status, no education, no kind of return to school letter to inform them a little bit. The school, despite being aware of the injury, as reported by the mom, really didn't have a protocol in place, and was unaware of any risks or precautions. And the PE teacher, obviously, as part of that, was somewhat uninformed about this. Now, I think the primary care did a pretty good job, but again, delayed access, got in, 4 or 5 days later, and not a whole lot of communication of symptoms. And they used the prescription pad for recommendations, which I have a real problem with. Sounds like we're hearing some sound here.
I know. I was just going to stop you and say, whoever's got background noise, could you manage that a little bit? Thank you so much.
Okay. So some opportunity. Clearly, this is a community that I've just started a clinic in a rural area over on the Delmarva Peninsula, as it's called, which is kind of more of an isolated peninsula east of the Chesapeake Bay and just on the coast. So some real opportunity for education of the systems there, some implementation of some standard protocols, again, defining kind of who does what, and certainly some better communication, and in this case, certainly between the emergency department and what the school was looking for, and definitely around safety precautions. Certainly the school is the expert in teaching and educating their students. Whether they knew how to translate, though, that kids' needs into accommodations and strategies is still a work in progress with many of our schools. But at the very least, the medical system should have been providing some safety precautions, no PE, nothing that would put her in an injury situation. So when we look at this and we think about concussion care for kids, the question is, what's our end goal? And from my perspective, first of all, it's identifying kids as early on as we can, as accurately as we can, trying to speed along recovery in as facilitated a way as possible, least amount of complications, but ultimately is to prevent and to promote brain health. So I have down below kind of the pieces of the puzzle all fitting together here. So we need some confidence, we need good communication between systems, and we need some good collaboration and coordination because there are moving parts here. And I like to think of all of this as somewhat of a medical neighborhood. I wrote a paper recently for the urgent care systems and what they might think about doing. And I talked about their role in the medical care system, connecting and coordinating care. So you have an injury, it's a point of entry. Many times it's not the medical providers, it's parents, it's coaches, it might be youth leaders, it might be kids. They're recognizing, responding, they get them on to some level of medical care. And then what we see is we hope that they get into an educated primary care system. Now, I'm a strong advocate of a primary care system that is informed and that knows their kids and can do some at least preliminary management of this. Sometimes, though, they need to move on to specialists and they need more active rehabilitation services. We know that our schools are somewhat variable across the country in terms of school nurses. Those that have it, it's, they're worth their weight in gold. And the same with athletic trainers on the sidelines, on the fields, on the courts. I think that's really important to have that system. And I look at this as ultimately kind of that potential medical system that needs to coordinate themselves. And then, of course, ultimately, concussion recovery is all about managing that individual's gradual return to their activity as their brain does its own job in repairing itself and ultimately recovering. And we talk about returning to school, obviously, to physical, recreational, sport activity, but also social activity as well. And so that's where I see kind of the neighborhood, the various kinds of moving parts, and the need to connect it and to coordinate the care. So what I would like to see again with all of this is when somebody's identified, preparing the family and the student with what they need to know, educating them about concussion. What is it? What are the risks? What do you want to do? Reasons why you would need to go back in an emergency situation to the emergency department. We talk about the red flags. What are those safety restrictions around sports or other kinds of risk activities? We know that kids are involved in many other physical activities that present risk. And then how do we manage kind of that activity across their day, ultimately getting them back to school or in some cases work, and making sure that they're following up with medical systems to help, again, define and redefine and guide that. So we're going to talk obviously about the school return process here. And what we know about concussions is they come in many forms and different kinds of effects. And really any of these kinds of sets of symptoms can play out. And we're still trying to understand on that left side, why is it that when the brain is perturbed, that is moved, stretch, strain of the brain tissue, chemicals released, electrical activity impaired, why is it that some people have certain kinds of effects and other people have other kinds of effects? That's the holy grail we're trying to understand right now. What we do know is that they present in a variety of symptom types, the 4 symptom types. So these various physical symptoms, the cognitive, the emotional, the sleep symptoms. And these things, happen variably, and anyone with their own particular injury might have any combination of these factors. We see these as ultimately the targets for supports. Again, basically what we believe is the brain does a pretty good job in working to recover. Now what we need to do is to support the systems, and I'm going to talk more about that as we move along. Epidemiologically, what's our best guess? Well, we still have a lot of work to be done to know how extensive this problem is. Certainly, we've heard about it a lot more. We hear that the diagnosis is going up. Most of that is because we're starting to put a name to a face, so to speak. And so we know that some of the sport literature, particularly with college and high school, in high school, male athlete says, well, expect 7 to 10 days for recovery. Well, I'm trying to rub that out because we have a study that I was involved in Canada using some of the tools that we developed where only 70% of the kids had recovered within 4 weeks, which means 30% of the kids had not. What this also suggests is that these recovery supports must plan for a window of time that might be several days, but may go out to several months. And so as you think about school supports, hopefully we can have better predictors of whether you're going to be that short versus long recover, but we're still a ways from that. So we've got to plan for that. So when we're talking about returning to school, and a school learns or has been told now that a student's been identified with a mild TBI concussion, the question for the school is, okay, what do we do next, right? So we talk about this return to learn idea, knowing that, returning to school is a kid's major job. They're learning new information, they're acquiring knowledge, they're practicing that knowledge so that they can make it permanent, and that's homework, right? Or classwork, and they're using their brains, they're mentally and physically exerting to make that happen, right? But I like to think even more broadly about return to life in school because there also are other factors as well that go on, and that's social interaction with peers, how you interact with teachers, manage the environment. We know schools come in all shapes and sizes and can be physically demanding on kids. But then also there's the academic and kind of emotional pressure of doing well And when an injury occurs, we know that all these things can be a challenge for kids as they're returning. So this is important that we think about not just return to learn, but also returning to all the various aspects of life in school. So when we think about that, again, we think about the medical system, and it's the, it ultimately is the handoff of the information that the medical practitioner provides to the school, right? But as you see, I use that football metaphor there, the handoff. Well, I was just in Canada doing a similar talk in Ontario, and we talked about communication, coordination, collaboration. And I like to think of the hockey world as being pretty darn good with that. In order to kind of score the goal, and hopefully our Capitals will do that tonight against those Pittsburgh Penguins. Enough editorializing there. Anyways, as we will go on and see that there'll be that teamwork. And that means that you have to define what's going on. Now, we published a paper a couple years ago, and this is Anne and Steve Hooper at UNC and Brenda in Pennsylvania, about how might states think about building in that infrastructure that can support students with mild traumatic brain injury. And we basically said there's 5 key elements that we think would be useful for a state to do this. One is to define and train an interdisciplinary school team. Who are those players in the school? The professional development of not just the school, but also the medical communities. We know that pediatricians want to help their kids, but oftentimes they're not quite sure what they're supposed to say and do to the schools, right? We also need to make sure that we've got good protocols to identify, to assess and reassess and monitor the progress of students and put those in place specific to concussion or mild TBI, and then have a flexible set of interventions that can be individualized to support that particular student's recovery needs. And finally, making sure that we do have protocols that communicate across the neighborhood, so to speak, across the medical school family team members. So we talked about these elements and made some recommendations for how you might go about doing that. So, it has to do with who are the players, what do they need to know, what tools to identify, what tools to intervene, and what pathways do they follow to make this happen. Another paper that I wrote last year was really talking now very specifically about what we're talking today, medical school partnership. Again, what are the roles and responsibilities? This is in the Journal of Child Neurology, 2016. I don't know if any of you want these papers, I can send them over to Melissa. Maybe they can make them available on the CBERT website. So let's talk about what we want to do in developing these kinds of systems, and what structures of support do we want to be building. So again, I'm going to talk now about the most recent conference in Berlin. This is not necessarily a forum that many school folks are familiar with, but there have been 5 international conferences in which they've looked at sport-related concussion. And starting in the second conference in Prague, there was no mention of children, of students, of kids. And I was at the conference and I kept getting up saying, well, we might want to think about this a little bit different for kids because ... And so this is now the 5th conference, and I'm proud to say that Berlin is now really beginning to recognize the needs, recognizing too that we have a long way to go. So 5 factors that we talk about. Number 1, and this is in a paper that was written on pediatric aspects of sport-related concussion. Number 1, age. So it turns out that this is not a linear process here. Some think that young kids, have a harder time than older kids, than adolescents, than adults. Well, it turns out that adolescents seem to be the most vulnerable group. They take longer to recover, longer to return to school, more concerned about the negative effects of that injury on their schooling than the younger kids. So there's something about adolescence there that we need to take into account. Also, depending on if you have a higher load, higher severity of symptoms, you're going to take longer to recover, and you're going to likely need more accommodations to help you. Course load. Certain kinds of courses are going to be more of a challenge. This is a study that we did where we found that math was the #1 challenge the kids reported. Hard for them to juggle that information in their head, little working memory demands, attentional demands. But reading and language arts was right behind it, #2. And then science and social studies was sort of followed that. So certainly won't say that any course was sort of left off the list, but certainly math and challenging reading language arts was an issue. Medical follow-up, so Berlin was saying, we really need to make sure that students, are followed, because there's one study that showed that kids who receive a return to school letter in the ED or afterwards in medical follow-up were actually receiving better academic supports. So again, that communication between the medical provider and the school seemed to be a facilitating factor. And then what the school has, and this is really Ann's study, great study if you haven't seen it. Schools with concussion policies that include a student or a parent educational program actually show better practice guidelines for concussion management, provide more accommodations with greater variety of accommodations for students, more likely to have a concussion management team at the school, and more likely to have students and parents who are more knowledgeable about what this injury is about. So again, schools are important, the medical system is important, how we identify the types of courses, the symptom load you come in with, and what your age is, which to some extent I look at age not only in terms of the unique neurological, kind of psychological aspects of adolescence, but also the demands, of course, that high school students are facing. So Berlin, in our pediatric paper, we recommended all schools should have a concussion policy that includes a variety of things that inform teachers, staff, students, parents, and they should offer appropriate academic accommodations. That upon the diagnosis of concussion, students should be provided with a medical letter that talks about the return to school, kind of giving them the guidance there. And that students should have early and ongoing medical follow-up to, again, track those symptoms, monitor recovery, but also communicate that to the school. And that students may in fact require some temporary absence from school after the injury. Now, we still don't know exactly what the predictors are, whether you're a 1 or 2 day out kid, whether you're a 1 week out kid. So those are some things we still need to understand. But the clinician should also pay attention to what you come into the injury with, because it seems that there are certain kinds of factors that prolong recovery and that they seem to then relate to your symptom burden and the extent of your recovery process here, and that adolescents may require more of that support. Finally, that just research is needed to understand all these kinds of things. When to send back, and again, why kids require those prolonged recoveries. So we think about it, we want to prepare the systems, we want to make sure the medical system is evaluating, we want to make sure that a team is receiving that kid and translating that into the necessary academic supports, that we're monitoring these the progress of these kids, and we're adjusting those accommodations and as we move along, and then again we're talking with each other. So as you hear, there's some common themes in terms of Berlin, in terms of what we wrote in our infrastructure paper. Now let's talk a little bit about what expertise we might think about within the team. So clearly the healthcare provider has a certain level of expertise. They have better knowledge of the injury, understanding the symptom manifestations, kind of tracking that recovery path, and understanding that how other health and developmental factors may play into this. So their task is ultimately to diagnose the injury, define kind of what that symptom burden is, and redefine it as they are recovering. Well, on the other hand, obviously experts on the teaching, the learning, how the environment promotes that. Their task, of course, then is to translate that injury into that injury information into the key supports that are going to optimize that student's learning and ultimately their recovery. So these two things obviously relate to each other, right? But there are unique aspects, and so it's important that we have ways of really sharing that information and collaborating together so that both sets of expertise benefit the student. Now, we know that school systems across the country vary widely in terms of their resources. And that's tough. You know, when in my Eastern Shore clinic, despite it being rural and not having a lot of pediatric medical services, every single school whether it's elementary, middle, or high school, has a school nurse in it. And that's done strategically because they are sort of the health centers, if you will. We know that school psychologists can play an important role, particularly when the cognitive or the emotional kinds of issues are playing a role. And then if you're in a high school, an athletic trainer can also be a good health resource. Guidance counselors really helping to guide some of the academic translation. We want supports from the administrators. We want our teachers prepared. And again, as we said, the healthcare provider really as a consulting role. And let's not forget, the family is really central here as well in promoting and supporting and really understanding the kinds of things that we need to do to help their child recover. So the roles here, and this is borrowed directly from Brenda's program, the Brain Steps program, a medical monitor and an academic monitor. These are two really important roles in school. Somebody comes in and we want to see who is going to monitor the symptom status of that student, hopefully using a tool that's going to have some, some standardization to it. Who's going to liaison with that medical community person, the pediatrician or whomever it might be, and who's going to kind of relay that down to the academic monitor. And that academic monitor is the one that really works with the teaching team. Here's the youngster, here's their symptom burden. Now let's see what we're going to do to help support that. And then liaisons between the student, the teachers, and the medical monitor, and certainly on the academic issues with the family. So if we think about, again, defining those roles and putting those in place. Now, again, those I talk about roles, not persons, but roles, because that may vary across school settings, across counties, across cities, across states. It's key that each role, though, is defined in some person. So this is a pathway that actually is part of a chapter that is about to be published in a book by Isabelle Gagnon and Alan Petito up in Montreal Children's. And it really is meant to be kind of a step through process from the point of number one, the school being notified of the concussion, to now all the way through monitoring and recovery, and what actions should those individuals take, what tools might be there to help support it, and how should the communication run. So for example, I'm notified that, Johnny had an injury, or let's take Ellie had an injury. Concussion management team is alerted. Email goes out to the school staff. FYI, just know that your student was injured. The medical monitor now gets information from the healthcare provider, gets a sense of when that youngster is coming back. Academic monitor says, okay, we now know what the symptoms are here, and we're going to start to think about what accommodations and adjustments might be put in place, because they're receiving the school letter, and they're ultimately now looking at the gradual return to school process. When the kid comes back that first day, checks in with the symptom monitor and the academic monitor, they sort of counsel them on how they're going to work through the process using some kind of a logging system that really helps to sort of track recovery. And then that monitoring occurs over time, periodically, using various tools to do that. And if the youngster is not recovering, that information is fed back to the healthcare provider, who might then suggest maybe some specialty services need to be put in place. But it also turns out that many of these kids are recovering pretty well, and just by giving that guided sort of gradual support system, many kids do well. So we look at return to school letters here. This is a letter that actually is part of not only that chapter, but a follow-up return to school article we're writing for Post Berlin. And again, key here for the healthcare provider: provide the diagnosis, define what the symptoms are there with that symptom table you see in the middle of the letter, provide what restrictions might be needed in terms of returning to school, returning to sports, or returning to recess, that's physical activity, returning to physical education, and then make some recommendations, some suggestions that you hand off to the school as they then think about how they're going to translate. So we've also published this return to school guide, which is really just how do you gradually start to reintroduce the youngster back into school from stage 0, which is I'm home because I can't tolerate much, but now if I can at least concentrate for up to 30 minutes before my symptoms really get bad, and those symptoms start to kind of reduce when I take a break. Maybe I can start out with some partial day of school, a couple of classes, some breaks built in, not a whole lot of expectations for productivity. But again, as things improve, you begin to attend more classes, build those rest breaks in, etc. And so that gradual return to school guide is it's not evidence-based at this point. We really need to be looking at these things, but it's more logical, what might you do to gradually increase? So let me give a little bit of a background to this, because when you're looking at this, you say, well, how will we know kind of what things to put in place? I mean, what do we use as our guide to start putting accommodations in place or to remove them? Okay, so if we look at this here, we look at the effect of the concussion on school learning and performance, but we can also see that school learning and performance can potentially affect concussion recovery. So let's look at those factors. Out of our shop, Danielle Ransom published in 2015 a paper in Pediatrics that was the first one to define the types of academic challenges that kids were having. We've had a number of different meetings over the years with the CDC and with other groups in developing accommodation systems and all that. And we mainly went with what we as clinicians were seeing happening. Well, we started to look at this more in a research context. And what we found is that, kids that were not recovered were compared with kids that were recovered. And obviously those who weren't recovered, much more concerned about how school was going to be affected, had many more school-related problems that they were reporting. And again, high school students reporting more so than middle and elementary. And that, excuse me, if you come into the injury with a higher symptom burden, you tend to have greater academic problems. Again, these are not huge revelations, but it was the first time that we really saw that, and we documented it. And that they were having greater challenges cognitively. So again, empirical evidence of the concussion's impact on learning and performance in the school. But it also becomes a way to identify the academic targets, things that we look at to support. Here's just a little bit of the data from Danielle's study. What kinds of school problems are you having since your injury? That was the question that we were asking kids. Headaches interfering. What you can see is about half the kids in the elementary school reported that. About 3/4 of the kids in middle and high school, they couldn't pay attention, right? You start to see this increase from the elementary to the middle school. It doesn't mean that kids in elementary were not having the challenges, just they were having maybe relatively fewer than those in the high school. And you sort of see it move up. And you see the average number of reported problems was 2.5 in the elementary, 3.5 in the high school, and close to 4 in the in the middle school was 3.5 and close to 4 in the high school. So again, we know that the challenges of high school are pretty significant, and these kinds of things, as you look down that left column, the type of problem are challenges to get through a school day. We look at the classes, and again, here's where you see the middle and high school kids, close to 60% of the kids were saying that math was really their toughest class. But again, almost half of them were saying that reading and science were challenges, almost a little over a third, social studies and foreign language. And so you can see the art class. That's where we want to send our kids, guys, right? We want to send them back to art. We seem to not have as much problem there. We've also done a study that was published recently that says, how do we look at academic outcomes and predict who may have the greatest problems? And so what we found was that this is called a receiver operating characteristic curve that basically is a prediction curve. What it says here, we looked at a group of kids that were defined as those with good academic outcomes and bad or tougher academic outcomes, as defined by the number of problems they were identifying in school. And we saw that their symptom load, the post-concussion symptoms, and the degree of their executive dysfunction, particularly their challenges with holding information and working memory and kind of getting the work done, those were things that were the greatest predictors of whether you're going to have troubles or not. So that suggests that these might be assessed regularly in planning supports, right? Those might be the targets there, right? We also ask questions, what percent of you are reporting increase in your symptoms with physical and cognitive demands? And what you can see again is the stair-step increase in symptoms from the elementary to the middle to the high school, with almost 2/3 of the high school kids reporting that. And you notice it's actually less in the physical activity. And why is that? Because we're actually better at restricting significant physical activity. But when they're in school, they're having to exert cognitively. So this is why we need to think about how do we support that. And the degree of the exertional effect indicates a need for us to manage those activity demands during the school days with accommodations and adjustments. So also, let's not forget the psychosocial issues, right? This is an invisible injury. Oftentimes TBI is just not appreciated. Kids look normal. They're cut off from their social group, and if they're on a team, and we see lots of kids in the performing arts that have these injuries, or they just can't go out and hang out with their friends as much because they're so dragged out and their heads are hurting badly. So these are things that result in, for some, a loss of identity. I'm not with the folks that I really identify with. I'm sort of out of the group. And of course, everybody wants to return back to normal, to return, contribute to their team or their social group. And so these pressures are significant. And of course, the pressures of schoolwork too. It's a huge issue. So these are factors that both can stem from the injury itself, that is the emotions being dysregulated, but also then the demand situations. And so we need to always take those into account. Very quickly, again, I talked about this already, the 6 stages of gradual return to school, from none to partial to full day with maximum supports, then with moderate supports, then with minimal supports, and finally no supports. Obviously, sort of a logical system here. But we also want to be sure, as we think about this, that this is not a rigid system. You may find that some kids are at home and they go back to school full day with moderate supports because their symptoms really resolve quickly in those first few days. So again, you've seen this list in the other chart that I showed you. We can think about what activities and what expectations do we put on kids, and then the right column is what criteria then do we use to move them on. And basically the simple rule is I'm able to do more without it significantly increasing my symptoms and requiring relatively fewer accommodations to get it done. So again, let's think about all these things. On the left-hand side, the post-concussion effect is really the target then for the student support and treatment. So the left-hand side, working memory, right? What is that? Functionally, that comes out in school. Like I can't hold instructions in my head when the teacher is either lecturing or telling me, an instruction. I'm having a tough time as I'm reading, holding on to that information. When I start at the beginning of the page, by the time I get to the end of the page, I've forgotten half the material, more so than usual. Or I'm juggling this stuff in my head, trying to do math calculations, and I keep forgetting it all. Or as I'm generating ideas for writing, again, I can't keep the goal in mind and the particular content and structure of what I'm trying to write. So what do we think about doing? Let's build a strategy in place, maybe giving relatively shorter assignments, break them down, maybe give a written instruction rather than oral instruction, allow the use of support tools like calculators, or maybe shorten up the reading passage in chunks. So there are things we can do when we take that post-concussion effect to accommodate and help out here. And again, we can think about headaches, so oftentimes headaches, which is the #1 symptom, it interferes with your ability to concentrate, makes you cranky. And so what do? We want to think about, again, rest breaks, maybe taking a time to short nap, something that really kind of breaks that adverse effect. Light and noise sensitivity, not uncommon, right? Well, we have kids sometimes wear sunglasses in school. We tell them, actually, you're cool, you're setting a trend, right? Or sitting away from the bright sunlight or nasty indoor lights that sometimes can be tough. The smart board, maybe looking at other ways here. So these are all targets on the left-hand side, the post-concussion effects, the way they may play out in school, and the accommodation or management strategies. So what we did is to sort of combine all these things. Say, okay, the symptoms on your left-hand side are the very symptoms that both the medical provider and maybe the school nurse are monitoring. Let's use this almost as, so we call it the symptom-targeted academic management plan, or the STAMP. Let's use this as our guide now for our accommodations. So the direct relationship between the symptom and the kinds of accommodations that may actually help. And this is almost like an IEP, if you will, for cognitive, physical, emotional kinds of symptoms that we see post-concussion. Again, I want to sort of reinforce there are some good tools, some good programs out there. as I mentioned, things from the CDC, the Brain 101 Concussion Playbook, the Brain Steps program, the REAP program, our care plan that we have as part of the CDC toolkit also tries to address some of these issues. So there are some good materials that you can be using now to really build this structure of this program and to guide kids' return there. So again, students identified with a mild TBI or concussion, what do you do? What is your strategy? How do you go about supporting that system? All those pieces of the puzzle sit there. What do you do? So in summary, you know, concussion care, it's a team sport. It requires, it's the neighborhood, right? Communication, collaboration, coordination. It's important that the medical and the school each really maximize their relative and complementary expertise, coordinate it, share it in a way that benefits the student. As we know, this can have a potential effect on the student and the athlete's life, or you might even say performer. Understanding the student's unique symptom profile is really the first step in supporting them. And that's where we take the stamp to say, okay, if you've got this array of symptoms, here are ways it may play out in school. Here are some things we're going to do to support that, and we're going to monitor to see how it goes. And again, good circular communication amongst the neighborhood and regular monitoring of the symptom and the response to those adjustments along the way is all critically important. Putting those pieces of puzzle together will really benefit the kids. So, you know, one of the other things we know is that there's lots going on now, and this is a little bit of a side issue, but I just want to mention it. There's been so much interest in concussion that there's a whole industry of what I call well-intentioned care. But we know that brain injury is complicated. Again, mild TBI is complex in terms of its diagnosis, in terms of its recovery. And so we really want to make sure that we are bringing good knowledge and the public health efforts of the CDC and educating. People have gotten into this whole baselining idea. It's interested in many disciplines, but it's very important. Get yourself educated on this. Go to the CDC website, grab those materials that I mentioned before, and it can be really, really helpful in guiding you in your school systems to support kids. Some may be interested in knowing that neuropsychological testing historically had been seen as very important, but actually is not seen as necessarily for all athletes now. Neuropsychologists are important to sort of use to be involved in this, and yet we're not always available to systems, and so we've got to find ways to make ourselves available. Interestingly, this whole idea of baseline testing in sport concussion is now being suggested that it's not recommended or necessary for all kids, and that's going to create a bit of a ripple. And again, we want to make sure that if we're doing good neuropsychological testing, it can contribute, but it ought to be done properly. I'm going to kind of move through these pieces here, and I want to talk about health promotion and then really get a chance to answer some questions here. Health promotion. How do we think about promoting health of the brain? Number one, and this is such a challenge I know for our high school kids, is sleep is critical. We know that not only for general health, but also for recovery. Sleep is so important. And when you don't have proper sleep built into a management system, into the treatment plan, kids have a much greater challenge. They don't have the, as I think about it, sort of the battery charged up to get them through the day. Managing stress, you know, this is very important. And when we're working with kids, we're trying to be very positively oriented, really give them the confidence that they can do the things to help manage their recovery as their brain does its job in normalizing the chemical disturbances, electrical disturbances. Physical activity. This is a critically important thing as we think now about concussion recovery. We actually now have programs in place, and Isabelle Gagnon and John Letty in Montreal and Buffalo, respectively, have nice physical activity programs that we think actually increase the blood flow and really increase some important chemicals that go to the brain. We know that important nutrition and also good hydration is the fuel for recovery. And then making sure the kids are not isolated, that they're engaging socially with their group, but to the extent that does not significantly worsen their symptoms. That's the key in concussion management, is get involved, re-involved in your activities, but do it only to the point where it's not increasing your symptoms. And we use the not too much, not too little principle of recovery. So I'm going to stop there and let's take some questions that hopefully you've been able to put into the chat box there, and let's talk about those issues you may have in mind there. So thanks again. Sorry for our little bit of a delayed start, but happy to take questions.
Okay, everybody, so now is your time to chat in the chat box and send some questions that I can read to Jerry. Jerry, while they do that, people are wanting the articles. I think we have them. So if you just send me the titles that you mentioned, I can send links out.
Okay.
And there's one question that came up before we got on, and it was wanting to know if you know anyone who does presentations on 504s and IEPs, kind of like the law stuff, or if you do that, or if you know anybody who does.
Actually, I was hearing you talk about that as I was driving in my car. I actually had you guys on. I couldn't talk, because I was driving. But I don't necessarily do that anymore. I used to years ago when I was. So some may not know this, but I was formerly a school psychologist before I went into neuropsychology, and that was about 30, dare I say, 5 years ago. And so I've always been abreast of kind of both the special education issues. I don't do that as much anymore. What I do now is more of to some extent it's 504 accommodations, but really teaching pediatricians and teaching medical providers about how you want to be contributing to the educational supports for kids with mild TBI. I don't know if Steve Hooper might. Obviously, Ann does, and your whole group does.
The only two I can really think of that I know are for sure myself and Karen McAvoy.
Yeah.
But I don't have anybody else off the top of my head. I know we have some great people in the state of Oregon that do it, and I know that probably every state has someone. Especially if you look at the like the ADA offices in your Department of Ed, they have some of that. I'm trying to figure out who's not muted, but I can't.
Sounds like we have a little ankle biter who's having fun.
So that's the answer to that question that we know. Here's the next one. What is your experience with students experiencing mild symptoms? Do the schools look at 504 plans or informal short accommodations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And boy, do I see variability across school systems. And again, I work with Delaware schools, Maryland schools, DC schools, and Virginia schools. And it varies from system to system. Generally speaking, I find that, and depending on how you define mild, most schools are not invoking 504 plans, probably don't need to. If there is a reasonable progression of recovery. And so my experience is that people will put in place, I don't tend to use the term informal because I think that cheapens kind of the importance of those supports. But yes, they put in more, if you want to call them informal supports that are hopefully tracked over time. I find that when kids have then recovery pattern symptoms, academic challenges that go beyond a month, then a lot of schools are starting to ask the question, do I put the 504 in place? And many will then engage it.
Yeah, that's about what we do here in Oregon. We have what we call an ITAP, and it's Individual Temporary Accommodation Plan. And we try to get that in place as soon as we know anything's going on. And that's kind of our interim to the 504, hoping we don't need a 504.
Yeah. That's our care plan to some extent is that as well. And I tell you, a lot of the schools rely on it. They ask, give us that care plan. Let us know, your thoughts, what you want to do.
Yeah, we have a kind of a checklist that can be sent out at the school to the students' teachers that kind of serves as the ITAP. That way they don't have to generate the accommodations out of thin air. They have something to look at. Kind of similar to what you showed.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Let's see. I have two actually. Let's see. How do you communicate with the school regarding students who aren't receiving the accommodations you suggested? Schools seem to quickly tire of supporting students.
You're kind of going in and out a little bit, but you said it sounded like you said schools seem to tire
Yeah,
to.
it says, how do you communicate with the school regarding students who aren't receiving the accommodations you suggested? Schools seem to tire quickly of supporting students.
Yeah, again, that varies so widely from school to school. So we have done lots and lots of work with our school systems as much as we can. Um, and, our care plan, again, every time a youngster comes into our clinic, they get the care plan, which defines the symptoms, which defines the manifestations that they're demonstrating, which shows kind of the exam they've done and the challenges they're having. And then again, we translate that into suggested kinds of issues. So we'll get in touch with usually the guidance counselor or the school nurse. But, I also ask the kids, who's your best champion in school here? And what do we need to do? And so we'll go sometimes to the assistant principals or the administrators and really talk about this, about really what the supports are, the fact they're going to be temporary. They're not, this is not a special education IEP issue that's going to be long-term. And that probably the more we do to support the youngster, the less they're going to need it over time. And, usually just kind of the personal touch and communicating with them and again, providing a little justification can be helpful. I usually find that it's a lack of understanding of this because the kid looks normal. And by sort of helping them to understand, yeah, the kid does look normal, but here's the challenges they're having and kind of laying those out for them. I find that tends to be reasonably effective,
Yeah,
but
and
not always.
on a more really positive note in that same uh, topic, I was at an IEP meeting today at a school that I have done a lot of entire school training, and it was probably one of the best IEP meetings I've been to because the whole team understood what was happening. And
Yeah.
once they got that, they were bending over backwards to help the child and provide support. So, piggybacking on what Jerry said, I really feel like it's all about as much education to people as possible, and then things
Yeah.
go a lot smoother.
And it's education. And one of the reasons why I sort of laid out that pathway is because, you know, uh, teachers are busy as all get out. My daughter's a kindergarten teacher, has taught kindergarten, first and second grade. And, as we all know, constantly besieged with, do this, do that. Here's the new program. And it's so hard to know how to really implement these issues. And if we can, you know, if we can give people a routine that is using the Mark Ilvasacker approach here, a routine that they can build into their day, and understand why they're doing it and actually see the benefits of how that can help the youngster, I think it does a world of good.
Yep. Okay, we got two more. So this one is, given your school psych background, what assessments would you deem to be absolutely critical and necessary in a standard TBI evaluation at school?
Yeah. So now the question is whether it's a mild TBI or whether it's a severe TBI.
That doesn't say, but
Yeah. So with mild TBI, quite honestly, I don't think a whole lot of formal cognitive or neuropsychological testing is necessary. Sometimes targeted. We know so if I'm going to look at the main things, the attentional, and this goes for severe as well, attentional, executive functions, and then the learning and memory. Those are essential. That is the information processing system, if you will. And of course, the executive functions stem beyond that and look at behavior and look at social and emotional kind of adaptation as well, but or at least plays out in terms of those domains. So those would be the things I'd want to be at least tapping into and either screening by asking some questions or using some scales, or doing some targeted testing.
um, uh, can I piggyback on that one as well?
Yeah.
I find when I'm working with the schools a lot that if they don't do some measure of executive function, a lot of the times the kids won't come up eligible. Um,
Yeah.
Especially if people are looking at cognition and IQ and those kind of things. And so I coach
Right.
I coach our schools here to really look deeply at executive function, um, and share information with them about how lack of executive function or deficits in executive function many years down the road manifests more strongly than it does at the given moment. And so thinking about the kids as they exit school for the next 60 years of their life or however long they're going to live, how can we set them up for the best road into adulthood?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's actually why we got into developing the tool, the brief, the behavior rating inventory, is that structured tests and IQ is kind of irrelevant, quite honestly, when we're talking about this. I tell people all the time, I tell parents, I never educated or rehabilitated an IQ, but I can tell you that when you're disorganized, when you're having troubles holding on to things actively in mind to try to get a task done, when you're rigid or inflexible about things, I can help manage and help you teach the behaviors to manage those situations. But in terms of an IQ or a block design test, no, that's not what we were able to do.
Okay, we have one more. This one says, have you found
Okay.
anything that helps determine malingering / schoolwork avoidance?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, so many of our symptom scales now have these, I wouldn't necessarily call it malingering, but certainly the effort related issues here. Is somebody really underplaying effort? So not only our rating scales of symptoms, but also our cognitive tests. And the other thing too is that, I mean, as a clinician, we also are looking at the big picture. Is there any reason why this youngster should be having these kinds of problems given this kind of injury at this point, post-injury? Sometimes we see kids, 8 to 10 weeks out with a relatively less forceful injury when they were making pretty good progress along the way, and all of a sudden things kind of spike up and become more of a problem. That doesn't fit a typical recovery. Something else is going on here. So you have to kind of know what's the normal trajectory of recovery. How does that likely relate to that kind of injury, and what other factors are going on, stresses or other kinds of things that may be playing into somebody trying to either fabricate or reduce their effort. Oh, we all there? Do we have our Melissa? Are you there?
Oh, sorry, I was talking with it muted. I was saying that we don't have
Oh, okay.
any more questions, and that it's everybody's last chance. So if you have a question for Jerry, we've got about a minute to get it going. Type fast. No, those were great questions, you guys. I'm so glad you did that. Those were super questions.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate the thought going into those.
Okay. Well, as I always offer at the end of the webinars, if you have any questions at all about anything related to brain injury or schools and IEPs, 504s, any of those kind of things, please feel free to email me. And if I don't know the answer, I'm sure we know somebody who does, and I will tap into our network of brain injury friends and get you the answer to your question. So please feel free to do that. Or at Siebert, we also have an Ask a Librarian function on our website, and you can always go to that and ask a question, and then the same process will find the answer for you. So I appreciate y'all being here today, and this is the last one for the year, so I hope to see everybody's names in the attendees box coming up in September. We will shortly have all of the webinars for next year posted, so you'll be able to register throughout the year for those. So thanks again, and have a super day, everyone.
Duckling.
All right. Bye-bye.